Hello and welcome to a new webcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askari. Today is Monday, May the 26th. Earlier this month, and this is something we reported on our website, but while the world was very, very busy with the negotiations going on between the United States and China in Geneva over the trade wars, the tariff wars, and later when President Donald Trump was visiting the nations of West Asia, the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and so on, making big deals. There was something else was going on at the same time, which is, I think, is equally or even more important. And that was the fourth ministerial meeting of the China Forum of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which took place on the 13th of May. I think continued for 2 days. And immediately after that, there was a summit between President of Brazil, Lula da Silva, and President Xi Jinping. And there are very important discussions and points taken up in this meeting. So we, as I said, we have a report on that. But today we have a special treat because I'm happy that we are joined today by Professor Italo Poti to discuss these matters. He's from Brazil. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you very much, Hussein, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. Professor Italo Poti is a lecturer in international relations at the Institute of Strategic Studies of the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil. He is also currently affiliated with the Guangdong Institute for International Strategies as a guest researcher. So thank you. I understand you are in Guangzhou now, and it's a bit late in the evening, but I appreciate that you are taking the time to be with us.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So there were a number of important things about this, the China, Latin American and Caribbean states meeting. It's called the CELAC, China-CELAC meeting. President Xi Jinping, although it's a ministerial level meeting, President Xi Jinping actually attended it himself and gave a speech. I wanted to ask you, first of all, what is so important about this meeting? It's the fourth meeting, but it's also the 10th anniversary of the China-CELAC nations. So what was special this time?
I believe this time we have a new context for the relation between Latin American, Caribbean countries and China. If you take the recent history, China became the largest trade and investment partner of the majority of the countries. If we exclude Mexico, China is the largest partners of all the region, Latin America and the Caribbean. And especially now with this new policy of the US, because it historically is a region very influenced economically and geopolitically by the US. And with this new policy of the tariffs, the Trump tariffs, protectionism, it's very important for the region to strengthen the partnership with China to counterbalance this pressure from the US.
So the United States considers this area, this whole region, as its backyard, which is a bit, but there's, of course, differences how the two sides deal with it. I mean, there are 33 countries in the CELAC nations, I guess. 22 of them are already members of the Belt and Road Initiative. Panama left this year, but we understand it was under pressure from the United States. We will talk about the Panama Canal a bit later in our program, but President Xi Jinping presented what he called 5 points or 4 plans for cooperation with the CELAC nations. What are these, briefly, if you can explain them for us?
First, to assess the commentary regarding the backyard, it's very important to remember that from the 19th century, we had the Monroe Doctrine by the US, which regarded the Latin America region as its sphere of influence, and it would enter war if a foreign great power tried to interfere in the region. Then, if you take the Cold War era, it was also another period of great influence of the US in internal affairs of Latin America countries. They supported military coups and regime change against communist movements in the region. If you take the 90s, there was the Washington Consensus, which was another round of influence of the US in the region. But if we take the trend from the 2000s until today, there's some kind of neglect from the US, we can say, and also Europe. If you look at the data, Europe also historically had great influence in the region, but then the US surpassed them. But if you take the middle 2000s, the US redirected the main goals of its foreign policy to West Asia and then to East Asia, with the pivot to Asia strategy, with the wars in East Asia before. So Latin America and the Caribbean were neglected. At the same time, China increased its influence in the region, but always in economic terms, in terms of trade, in terms of investment. Now, the talks with CELAC and the closer ties between China and CELAC represents an opportunity for the region to have some problems, historical problems. One of them, number one, infrastructure. China is able to provide huge investments in infrastructure, which is a gap the region faces. Brazil, which is the largest country of the region, tried to make some initiatives to build infrastructure and integration of the region, but now closing ties with China, it is a very good opportunity to make things happen and to increase, to have better infrastructure in order to integrate the region. For China, on the other hand, it's a remarkable market to increase its exports and its economic expansion. So, as China usually try to build its relations, it's an opportunity for win-win cooperation. When we look at the kind of relations the US historically established with the region, it was always very different because the US demands internal reforms, the regulation of financial markets, commercial opening, and so on. And what we observe until now is that China behaves completely different. It's try to make deals without interfering in internal affairs. So I believe for CELAC countries today, this meeting is very important because it represents this opportunity. And integration of this region is a historical challenge for us because we have a huge potential for economic development, and we have at the same time a lot of social and economic problems like poverty. China is a very good example of overcoming this kind of problem. Even Brazil recently, we make significant improvements in these areas, but it requires economic development. So, in a globalized economy, it's very important now for the region to close ties with China. And again, if we compare with the US now is pushing for deglobalization. In this logic of competition with China, the US looks kind of desperate with the Chinese growth and tries to push back the process that they initiated, they ignited
Right.
in the past. So
Yeah.
I believe it represents great opportunities for the region.
Yeah, we saw this very good example of this in the trade wars and the tariff wars, because when the United States imposed tariffs on China, China imposed tariffs, very high tariffs, and bans on American agricultural products. So in this whole battle between the United States and China, China said, well, we have other markets. So even in the first Trump administration, the Brazilian soybean, Argentina also beef and other agricultural, China could easily switch to Latin America, to Brazil, to get the products they needed to get from the United States. So American farmers were the big losers here. So this is one thing, but also there's as you said, there was this question of social and economic development. It's very interesting that you say that the interest of the United States but also more Europe in Latin America has shifted, is not emphasized in the relationship, and China is going there. I mean, there was one social and cultural issue here. We don't know very much about Latin America and the Caribbean region because of not only the distance, but there is also very little interest. But also we have, thanks to Hollywood, the only things we know about Latin America is these coups and military coups and the drug cartels and all this stuff. But Latin America is a fantastic continent. It's like West Asia, the so-called Middle East and Arab countries. We have enormous wealth. We have enormous potential. I mean, Brazil was it was an industrial nation in a certain sense. And in Iraq, my native country, in the 80s, we used to have the most popular car was what's called Brasili, which is a Brazil-made Volkswagen. And this is one of the most important cars in Iraq in the 80s. And we imported very much of that. And there are other industrial capacity in Brazil, but also Argentina. So the image of Latin America is a bit skewed in a sense in the West generally, but also in the rest of the world. Now, you mentioned the question of infrastructure because the opening of the Chancay port last year was like a wake-up call for a lot of people in a positive sense in Latin America, but also in the United States, because suddenly they realized that, oh, we don't build ports, we don't build railways, we don't build hydropower, and this is what those nations need. So my question but you answered it directly, is that what can China offer which the United States and Europe don't? And I think there's also a factor of financial and credit for infrastructure is also a big problem for the nations in Latin America. And I'm sure Brazil, your country, we can discuss a bit about also the bilateral Brazil-China relations, but Brazil is very active in the question of a new international financial order. And the former president Dilma Rousseff, who's now the head of the chairman of the Brics, the new development bank, and she has very sound ideas about productive credit for infrastructure, both for developing nations generally, not only for Latin America, but Africa. She's very strongly an advocate of cheap credit for infrastructure projects. So I would like to show you, because we talked about this question of integration of the infrastructure. There are many missing pieces here. It looks like also the Arab countries, because the Arab countries, we have one identity, we have one language, but our economies are not connected. And that's why economic development is lagging behind, because we have areas where you have large resources, natural resources. We have areas where we have population and human resources. We have areas where we have financial resources, but no natural. So how important is the integration of Latin America in terms of infrastructure, and what China can play for a role?
Yeah. One important thing and first of all, you mentioned Iraq. In the 80s, Brazil and Iraq had cooperation on nuclear energy development, which was very important. Brazil advanced a lot in this. We have some nuclear plants, but we faced a lot of pressure from the US. And
That's
Iraq,
true.
as everybody knows, suffered a lot more pressure because the US entered in a war.
Yeah, Brazil was very much appreciated.
Yes, Brazil tried to pursue an independent foreign policy, and we pursued a nuclear program for energy. And Iraq was a great partner of Brazil in exchanging technology and so on. But regarding the infrastructure and integration, the map you just showed us, it presents when we see the roads, I can see clearly what are the gaps there. We have two great natural obstacles for integration. One, the Amazon forest in the north part of South America, and the other one, the Andes chains of mountains. We have a huge chain of mountains which uh, divides great part of South America. Uh, so for Brazil, it always was very difficult. We never had access to the Pacific unless through the Panama Canal. So China now has a project in Brazil to build a connection with the port of Chancay, which is
In
really a
Peru.
game changer for the region to promote greater integration with the Asia Pacific region, which is the most economic dynamic region of the world. Uh, so this is the great problem. To promote integration in this continent, it requires a lot of investment, a huge amount of capital, and China today can provide it. And it's very important to remember that a lot of the projects, the BRI projects that are being signed, they include infrastructure and technological transfer. Uh, you know, inside the project. So you can promote development in this sense, but it's also is very important to remember that it's not only due to external factors that a country develops itself. It's important to have a strategy. A great challenge is the role of the state because the private sector in any country it doesn't have the capabilities of promote investment like the state. Western countries historically used their states to push their
That's
development.
true.
And then later they try to avoid that other countries
Yeah,
try the
that's
same
the
path.
essence of, you mentioned the Washington Consensus in the 1980s when the United States and Britain, they pushed this neoliberal policy that there should be a small state, that the market and the private interests will run the economy more efficiently than the state. But even in the West, in the United States and in Britain and in Europe, the industrialization process was actually centralized by the governments before that. And
Yes.
now they are telling nations in the developing sector, no, 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 you shouldn't do like we did. You should listen to us, but not do as we do. So
Yes.
do as we say, but don't do as we do. But
Yeah,
that's what
there
when
is
we
an
see.
important book by Ha Jong Chang, the Korean economist. It's called Kicking the Ladder. Uh, he uses the same term that was coined Friedrich List.
Friedrich List, yes.
Friedrich List. It's the idea they climb the ladder and then they kick the ladder in order to the others doesn't climb it.
Right. There's the one important thing in being developing nations. There's a new shift in Africa, but also in Latin America during the third Belt and Road Forum in Beijing in 2023, which I and my colleague attended. The president of Argentina, the previous one, I think he talked about, it's like in Latin America you have a lot of raw materials, lithium and iron and copper, but there's a lot of export of raw materials, like in Africa. And now they say we are not satisfied with exporting cheap raw materials and importing industrial goods. Now we want to use our raw materials for developing them at home. Like lithium, we can produce batteries. We need to have battery plants in our country, so we can raise the added value. Because the added value generally, we have this dependency theory that the nations in the core, the industrial nations, they take raw materials from the poor countries, developing countries, very cheap. Then they turn them into industrial goods, and then they export them. So you sell your cheap raw materials, but you import very expensive goods, and the added value goes all to the others. And there was a monopoly of a technology, but China now said, well, if you want to develop your industries, we are willing to. And there's a steel production, there's and other types of mining, not only mining, but also metals industries developing and growing in Latin America. So there's enormous raw material wealth, but the value goes to somewhere else. So
Yes, yes.
there's this industrialization sense that with the Belt and Road Initiative, you have a new process going on here, which is modernization and industrialization.
Yes, yes. And today we have, besides that logic that you mentioned, this unequal trade with raw materials, commodities versus technological high value-added products. We also have another logic of the global value chains because the Western countries from the 90s, 80s, and 90s, they began to concentrate on the most high value added segments, and you have on a globalized production intermediate and low value added, but it's still industrial manufacturing, but it has much less value added. So I believe that it's a path that China ascended through this path. First, the low level, then intermediate level, and then you manage to have high tech, high value added production, and more important than all, your own brands. You have to own the brand because Mexico is a good example of this in Latin America. Because if you look at their exports, uh, you will see a huge percentage of high value added, but it's not their brands. It's American from US factories inside there. So it kind of blurs the reality because it's not Mexico own technology. So it's important. It's what China is doing now. They have their own brands. Huawei, they have a multitude of brands. I'm here in China now, and I can see it with my own eyes. And Brazil tried to have, for instance, an automobile production, a national production with their own brands. But we already had at the time, it was the 50s, the 60s, Mercedes-Benz, even Swedish brands, Volvo, Scania. If you look at capital goods like trucks, tractors, and buses and so on, and Volkswagen and GM, Ford, and those American industries, they tried to they sabotated the Brazilian effort. So it's also it's always was very difficult for us to try to engage in partnership with Western countries and try to develop ourselves. What I expect today with China, and from what we can see until today, how China is behaving with its partners in Asia, Africa, and now they are coming stronger. We can feel it now in Latin America. Is a different logic and try to promote a more equal. Of course, China now is not a developing country like Latin America. We cannot see China like this anymore. China is kind of a core country today with a very sophisticated industrial production. So at the same time, if we look at the partnership built between, it's not a good time to remember that, but US and Europe, because these relations are in crisis today. After World War II, it was a very constructive partnership for both sides. I believe China can have this role today for the global South. And we must include West Asia, Africa, Latin America, these regions that shared a past of colonial exploitation, directly or indirectly, indirect exploitation, and try to build development and international cooperation in different terms, more inclusive. And you have a human aspect to this because we are talking about regions that deal with sometimes not only poverty, but extreme poverty and violence and very severe social problems. Uh, and I believe another discussion that is important to make today is regarding the Chinese model, because it's very common in history when a country has such a high level of success that other countries will look at this experience and try to see what we can learn, what we can take for our country. But again, it's important that to say that each country have its specificities, and we cannot replicate a model in another country, but we can take the good examples and try to apply what fits your specific reality. And I believe Latin America can look at this. It happens a lot here when I'm talking with colleagues here in China, that they look at Brazil history. From the 30s to the 80s, Brazil was growing at 10% rate GDP growth a year. And it looked like China from the 80s, 90s until now. So, but at some point, Brazil stopped this process. And we can look at some common aspects, even taking in consideration that are different realities. The role of the state is essential to promote development and to address, and in big countries with big populations, you have to have some centralized, planned government to address these big issues. But However, from the 90s until today, Western countries, the US, aligned with Europe, we can include Japan because this concept is not geographical, this West. It's a certain group of countries that make an alliance. And from World War II until today, or not today, but until recently, were very dominant countries. Now they are losing ground to China. And I believe other global South countries are pursuing this path together with China.
Yeah, this is an interesting point you are raising because, on the one hand, even the Chinese themselves, they say that you cannot replicate the Chinese model because it's very specific to China, which is true. But there are certain things you can learn, as you say, from other countries. In Latin America, I think there's this dilemma because overnight, a nation which has a certain, state-centered or even socialist government overnight can suddenly shift to a completely neoliberal. So it's like we saw in Brazil in the previous administration after President Rousseff with Bolsonaro, completely shifts the policy. And then President Lula da Silva comes back. He puts things back on track. Now Argentina with the Milei, a total break with the past, and then a shock therapy. So this seems that this is a recurring theme, a recurring dilemma in Latin America to find a model which suits them, not something which comes from outside. And I think Brazil is a great example because, as you said, actually even the United States helped in the early development of Brazil. I think President Franklin Roosevelt had many fantastic plans working, I think his advisors working with people in Brazil. So you don't need to be either communist or total neoliberal. you have to find the model that fits your conditions, your people.
Sure. And China is the best example of this. They mixed they kept their model, their political and economic model, but they made some reforms and adjustments to be integrated into the globalization process. In the case of Brazil, when we can apply that to other Latin America countries, of course there are differences. If you take the bigger countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and smaller countries. In Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina were the most successful in the industrializing strategy. But what we lack today, and it's important what you said is long-term strategy, because these sudden changes uh, of government. We have one party for 4 years and then it completely changed for the next 4 years. You cannot have a long-term strategy, which is a fundamental condition for development. You have to follow a path, follow a strategy, and it not happens in 4 years, in a short period of time. To get the results, you have to keep this strategy going on.
Yeah, this is
And
sorry, go ahead.
no, you
No, I
can.
mean, like, for example, if you want to build infrastructure, you build infrastructure, you build power plants, railways, these things that take long time, not only to construct, but to also to get the economic and social benefits. So it's about 25-year span. You have to think, like, you educate a child from the day they go to school to they finish university. It's like a 20 years journey. So you cannot have, trying to get profit from a child, as I think Jeffrey Sachs discusses this very well. He said, you can't expect after 6 years in school, you expect the kids to give you back money for the education you spend on them. They have to go and finish university. It's the same with infrastructure. It's the same with industrial programs, space programs, nuclear power programs, and so on and so on. These things that take long time, you have to have steady financing and backing and manpower and human resources behind them, like China did, like the high-speed rail system. It's a 20-year project, it just didn't just pop up like this. You have the space program, you have many other things that you have to balance and get. And this is something which is very badly understood around the world because of this neoliberal thinking that the private market knows better. So infrastructure should be built by private companies, but no private company will build a railway system to get 1% profit. They can make 10% profit in the stock markets.
They want the state to make the investments, build the railroad, and they privatize so they can buy
later,
for a cheap
they
price
just get the
and
juice out of it.
Yes, yes. But you mentioned something very important. It's important. The role of the US, you mentioned Roosevelt in the past. The first steel industry in Brazil was made with technological cooperation with the US. It's the basic industry so that you can advance to the other kinds of industry, consumers, goods, and so on. The steel industry is the basis. So it was a result of a partnership with the US at this time, the 40s, the 50s. The Bretton Woods systems, under the Bretton Woods system, Latin America had room of maneuver to have state-led development strategies. Then with the neoliberal turn, it changed completely. It's when Brazil stopped its development strategy. It was state-led strategy. Brazil had an authoritarian regime at the time, and it's another complex thing in Latin America because most countries had economic improvements and development under authoritarian regimes. And in the 80s, most of these regimes, these countries were democratized, democracy returned to be the political system. And at the same time, they adopted neoliberal economics. So
That's the
it's a
dilemma. That's the
confusing
dilemma.
thing because I understand a lot of people, and even myself, we criticize the authoritarian rule that we had, but at the same time, the economics, the development strategy had good aspects. You cannot throw everything on a trash can. It's not
Yeah,
that simple.
true.
And
Like,
today, if I can change the subject just a little bit, uh, uh,
yes,
we
go ahead.
have internal divisions inside Latin America countries. Uh, to try to make it simple, usually you have a traditional elite which is pro-West. They are neoliberals. They prefer to align with the US or European Union, and they advocate more and more liberal reforms. So they want to cut education, health expenditure in order to have fiscal stability and to have a good environment for the markets. So it's very market oriented. And you have usually left-wing segments, and it's complex. You have different specificities in each country, but usually tends to uh, advocate for state initiative and partnership with the global south. In the foreign policy, they try to privilege relations with the global south, but not to cut relations with the US, because it's another important thing to say. Let me take Brazil. Let me take Brazil as an example. Even though China, from 15 years until now, is the largest trade and investment partner of Brazil, the US is the number two partner. And Brazil cannot preclude this partnership from night to day with the US. It would have strong consequences. That's why Brazil lives with this dilemma. Try to balance between the US, the geopolitical pressure from the US, and the new possibilities, the new opportunities with China and global South countries. Brazil even tried to counterbalance the US influence with Europe, trying to make agreements, economic partnerships with Europe. An example of this is the Mercosur, the economic bloc of the Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay with the European Union. So even Brazil tries to diversify as much as it can. West Asia is an important region historically for Brazil. It's a great market for Brazilian. Brazil is the leader in the production of halal meat.
Yes, that's true.
So, but it's just to mention one example. So the friendship, the partnership between West Asia and Brazil is very important for Brazil. And you have a strategic component in this, which is oil. With the regions rich in oil is important. Brazil is another country which is rich in oil, and it's a kind of strategic cooperation that we can build. And I believe if we come back to China, China can have an important role today, a pivotal role in getting these regions together. I believe this global South identity, if you analyze more critically in political terms, it can be an important mechanism to. And we have, I believe we can talk about this if you want. We have now formal international organizations from the Global South, like Brics. And I believe the Belt and Road Initiative is a kind of a Global South initiative now, spreading from Asia, passing through Africa to Latin America, even trying to reach Europe.
Right.
It's a really a kind of Global South initiative with a Chinese leadership.
Yeah, we are here in Sweden. I mean, we advocate that Sweden and Western Europe should join the Belt and Road, should join the Global South, because this is where the future is. I mean, I have discussed many times how important it is to look at Africa the way the Chinese look at Africa, because Africa is a great opportunity. Here in Europe, we consider Africa as a problem, a burden. We have immigrants coming from Africa, but we never thought about what about giving people in Africa a better living standard, so they stay in their
Yes.
countries, like this is what China is doing, because Africa needs its young people, educated people to build Africa. And Europe is not looking at Africa this way. We think it's just problems coming from Africa and not a great opportunity, because that's where the future is. And this is the next question on, because what the United States is doing is isolating itself, but also destroying the work of others. Like we talked about Panama Canal, but also the Panama left the Belt and Road Initiative this year, but more nations are joining. But now the United States is pressuring Panama and the Chinese companies active in the Panama Canal to, leave the place because this is an American protected security issue, which is not true, because most of the cargo going through there is coming from China to the United States. But now part of the discussion. This was not in the China-CELAC discussion, but it's everywhere. People think about it. It's the Nicaraguan bi-oceanic canal, to build a new canal parallel to the Panama Canal, not only because of the geopolitical pressure, because the Panama Canal is congested too. There are long queues for ships to pass through the Panama Canal. So you need actually more. It's like the Suez Canal. You had to build a second Suez Canal because the volume was increasing. And therefore, there was this idea to build another canal. It's a bit more complicated and longer than the Panama Canal. But with today's technology, it could be possible is to build a canal from the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua at the Bluefield port, and then through the, I think, Cholontan Lake, and then another, to dig another canal to the, I think it's called the Cortino port on the Pacific Ocean. This is a very, very big undertaking. It is like 450 kilometers long, and it would estimated to cost $50 billion. And Chinese companies have been willing to work with that, but it is a very big issue. And I don't know how this is being considered in the rest of Latin America, as we talked about the integration of the infrastructure, but to bring these oceans together, not only in the Panama, but also in Nicaragua. How important is that? Is it something people talk about?
Yes, yes. First of all, if you take Panama history, Panama was a part of Colombia and it was separated from Colombia because of the canal. It was an independence promoted by the US with geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. So I believe what you say, I agree completely. From the economic rational point of view, it's important to have more than why only one canal. If you have a large number of ships and trade passing through there, it's better to diversify and have more options. I know that Nicaraguan government has the interest in doing so. There is a Chinese investor also with agreements with Nicaragua to do this, but they suffer a lot of pressure from the US, and the pressure on Nicaragua is the same kind of most countries in Latin America historically faced from the US. When you go against what they consider, they regard as strategic, they go to great lengths to interfere in the country in order to get their interests preserved, which is they want to preserve the Panama Canal, the Panama Canal as their asset. But what we see today is we have more Chinese goods passing through Panama Canal. But it's a result of the global economy. Its economy. What you can do about that? They are trying to use a geopolitical instruments and security concerns to fight economic logic, and it's an important thing. Because what I see today in Latin America is we have two great powers with strong presence in the region. The US always was there, and now China. But now what we see now, China is operating in an economic logic, trying to promote investments, trade, and so on. Of course, China has its interests, and it's pretty normal. Every country has its needs, its interests, but China behaves that way. The US today more and more talks about security concerns in the area. So they are not more focused in economic initiatives. If you remember the 90s, there was a strong initiative from the US to build a free trade agreement to all the American continent, including North America, Central America, and South America. And Latin America countries face a lot of pressure to sign this agreement. But in the early 2000s, we have 9/11, and then the US shifts its foreign policy to West Asia. And always good to remember to our audience, it's countries like Iraq, Iran, the region that they call Middle East, but uh, uh, they are in fact West Asia. Um, and then the US began to neglect relations with Latin America. They forgot about this free trade agreement. They kind of abandoned this initiative. Uh, and if we look today, more and more the US are raising security concerns in the region to put pressure. I will give one example. You mentioned the how Panama was pressured to leave the BRI, and we can take Brazil as example. Brazil visited China last year. President Lula have a lot of talks with President Xi Jinping regarding Belt and Road Initiative, and a lot of analysts and commentators were expecting Brazil to sign the Memorandum of Understanding of the BRI. But Brazil did not sign the MOU, but at the same time signed 37 agreements of infrastructure and trade investments
Right.
in Brazil. So it's a kind of trying to balance. But what the US said, the US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, at the time, Catherine Tai, she said it's a security threat. It's dangerous to Brazil to sign this agreement. But talking in terms of security, it's a
Mm.
security threat. Uh,
Yeah.
and if you read Brazilian media today, you wouldn't believe me, Hussein. They talk about Hezbollah operating inside Brazil. You
Yeah.
wouldn't believe it. They are now raising security concerns and try to get more leverage and influence in the region in the security field. While China, at the same time, is increasing its presence with economic cooperation. So I believe it's a very hard game for the US today because Brazil, Argentina, Chile, we don't have security threats. If you
No.
compare with other regions of the world, we don't have this kind of war and major conflicts in the region. So I believe it's a weak hand now to play for the US, trying to raise security concerns. And there's a lot of room for China to increase its presence. And again, it can be a good opportunity. It's up to Latin America countries also to get good deals, because another interpretation for regarding Brazil's negotiations with China, BRI, signing the BRI or not, is Brazil is trying to gain leverage and get a better deal. It's normal in international affairs. Uh,
Yeah. The
but
formality is not as much important. It has a psychological effect or
yes,
otherwise. But
but
yeah.
at the same time, there's another thing that the signing a MOU, it's more kind of symbolic gesture. Of course, you are intending to do something, but a lot of countries sign MOUs and nothing happens after
Right.
that.
Right.
But but in international affairs, symbols matter.
Mm.
You are showing to the international community what are your priorities and what are your strategy. And I
Yeah.
believe for Brazil, I really hope that Brazil could sign the BRI MOU last year. But I believe it can happen.
Yeah. There's
And
one.
The US policy today can push Brazil and Latin America countries more to the side of China because they are
Right.
putting tariffs on us too.
Exactly. No, it's the zero-sum game mentality, which is also the root cause of the security problem, which doesn't exist really. But it's to undermine the other party because the more the other party gets, the less I will get. But it's a fight over a small and even shrinking pie. Instead of making a pie bigger enough for everyone, it's like the Chinese say, the ocean is big enough for everyone. But it's the zero-sum game that there's only limited economic resources, and if we, you know, if China takes, we will lose. That's very wrong. And Latin America's economy is like, even with the infrastructure, when West Asia, Africa, when their economies start to grow, you will need 10 times more infrastructure. You need more Panama canals. You need more Suez canals. You need more. So it's not a fight over a small thing. But as long as your mind is limited to these zero-sum game, uh, everything becomes like a security threat, a security issue, a geopolitical issue. I think we are coming to the close, but it's good you took up Brazil because this is a very important issue. Because Brazil, whenever you talk about Brazil and China, everybody comes to mind is Brics, the Brics countries. And so is Brazil's relationship to China more a bilateral affair, or is it more integrated into the bigger BRICS? I mean, the BRICS is gaining enormous leverage internationally. President Lula da Silva was in Moscow celebrating the Victory Day there with President Putin, President Xi Jinping, and leaders from other countries. So how does Brazil-China relations have a separate characteristics than the China and Brazil being members of the BRICS?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and the BRICS summit this year will take place in Brazil. Brazil is the chairman of BRICS this year. What I think about your question is that the two things are very important and they are connected. Brazil-China bilateral relations are very important. We are talking about two big countries. China is the largest trade partner of Brazil, and Brazil have a surplus with China. So it's essential for Brazil to keep good relations with China. At the same time, these two countries, they prefer to operate in the world in multilateral terms, trying to get consensus and trying to be more inclusive with other countries. And I believe Brazil and China both are interested in strengthening BRICS and build BRICS as this great multilateral platform to build, let's say, a more inclusive, equal globalization, which the traditional multilateral institutions, Western-led institutions like WTO, IMF, and so on, was not able to build. They build institutions with unequal rules. If you take the Europe-Brazil relations, the WTO discussions, Europe demands from Brazil opening of markets, and when Brazil demands opening of agriculture markets to low barriers and tariffs, Europe doesn't want to concede, to give for Brazil this. So they always elaborated the rules in unequal terms because they were very dominant in the past, but it doesn't reflect the reality anymore. If we take global South countries as a whole, they are, I not have the precise data, but I believe it's more than 50% of the global GDP today, if we take the whole global South. So the G7 days are gone. They are not more the largest part of the global GDP of the world. It's not like that anymore. So international rules, international institutions must reflect this new configuration of the world, and it can be good for everyone. It's like you said, let's make a bigger pie so everyone can have its slice. And I believe BRICS can play this part. It's very important, I believe, to include more countries and to establish and consolidate its mechanisms. We already have the New Development Bank. I believe they, until today, having important projects, mostly in Africa, and it's very important because it's a continent which needs more credit and investments. Uh, but there's at the same time, it brings challenges because it's a very heterogeneous group, have different countries, uh, and the challenge is to find the common ground.
Mhm.
I believe every country in BRICS are interested in development and to solve its social problems because a lot of global south countries have, unfortunately, these problems. And I believe another important thing in BRICS is to not interfere in internal affairs
Yeah.
of its member. It's about foreign policy and to build consensus and alignment uh, regarding
Yeah, also
international
very much focused
goals.
on the economic development aspect, and
And
that
yes,
that's
and
why it becomes so attractive. Now the BRICS is growing, and the BRICS original BRICS members are open for new memberships. Like we have the Iran, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Ethiopia. These are rising economies, actually, even though relative to other are not the big shots in the world. But I think the BRICS, as I think it was Prime Minister Modi said many years ago, is that it's not defined, but what it is now, it's defined by its potential. That's that's what we have to think about. What is the potential of these BRICS nations? What is the potential of the global South? What is the potential of all of Africa? And I think President Dilma Rousseff made a very big case on the Grand Inga Dam financing, which is the could be the world's largest hydropower in the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, but it has no financing. Nobody wants to finance it. And so the concern about the BRICS is not only for its members, but it's about the whole global South. And I think
yeah,
this is where an area, yeah,
I like to make one remark, and I believe BRICS today, in the present context, with a great amount of instability, and it's being promoted by the most richest country in the world, the hegemon, the United States. BRICS can has a big challenge today, is to bring stability for the global economy, and I believe BRICS have this potential to be a multilateral group that brings instability in a context of chaos and uncertainty because we have now the US with an unpredictable behavior.
yes. Well, Professor Italo, we have covered more than we had hoped for. It's great. I'm very happy that we could take so much time. But I'm sure there will be new developments coming up. And we will be very happy to have another discussion because there's so many things we can discuss. The whole continent and the whole world is involved here. But I really appreciate that you have your insights as a Brazilian expert and citizen. You can give us a picture, which is we are very far from there. So I really appreciate your taking the time and giving us some of your insights.
Oh, I have to thank you. For me, it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you. It's a very important institution that you are part of, the BRICS Sweden. For me, it's an honor to be here and to discuss this subject with you, reaching your audience. And I hope I did my contribution here
That
for
was
you.
that was great. Thank you very much. Looking forward
Thank
to meeting
you.
you again.
Thank you. Thank you.